We model what we do after what Christ did. He offered compassion that gave people hope, and then he gave them help. And so we do the same thing with someone who's facing a pregnancy decision. We meet them at their point of need, and then we call them into this relationship so that we can start offering them the type of support that they need and try to help them understand their options and understand that this life growing inside of them is not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for.
Roland, I so appreciate and respect your position on these issues, and also I love your background. You graduated from Princeton and from Wharton School of Business. You spent 20 years in the corporate world working for companies like IBM and Goldman Sachs, and now you are investing your time dealing with the issue of life. What led you to CareNet?
Well, it's interesting. It's a sort of a longer story that I'll say very quickly, but when I was in college, I got my girlfriend pregnant. We were both undergrads at Princeton, and I was a junior, she was a sophomore, and she was encouraged to abort. And she didn't want to do that. We decided to get married despite the encouragement to abort. And we've been married for over 40 years. And so pretty early on, as a kid who grew up without a dad, I was kind of moved into fatherhood and had the life issue and the fatherhood issue both come together. So as I left Princeton and went into the business world, I thought that's where God had me. But the reality is that lesson that I learned way back when I was a 20-year-old college student was really very connected to the work that God has given me to do. I kind of think about myself in many ways like Wilberforce, these two great objects. He had these two great objects, reformation of manners and abolishment of slavery. For me, it's really helping those who are vulnerable from the standpoint of those in the womb, but then also building strong families and helping fathers be the best dad that they can be. And certainly the life issue is sort of ground zero for both of those things. Fatherhood begins at conception, and so it's very much connected to the work that I do and the call that God has for me and my personal story and personal narrative. And just to finish that, my wife ended up graduating from Princeton, not with just one kid, but with two. I told her she'd never become a doctor or whatever if she decided to have the child. Well, she's been a doctor practicing over 25 years. So I've seen in my own life how, when you use God's plan and you focus on what God has called us to do, don't let one mistake be complicated with a second mistake, that being an abortion. We can see the abundance from that.
I want to make sure that people don't miss something you just said. You just said fatherhood begins at conception. Think about that. We hear about life and whether or not that begins at conception, but fatherhood and motherhood begin at conception, and that's absolutely true. There was no one who needed to tell me that when my wife got pregnant, that I was a father. I already knew that. She knew that she was a mother. We were already beginning to take care of that little baby as soon as we found out that she was pregnant. And I love that you are reminding us that men have a huge part in this issue of life and whether to abort or not abort, because we're told often, men, you have nothing to say about this. This has nothing to do with you. This is not your body. You stay out of the whole thing. But you have something very different to say. What is your message?
Really, if you think about it from that perspective, one of the things that Roe did is that it disconnected fatherhood and motherhood in the womb. So now legally with Roe, with the law set up basically a situation where a woman becomes a mother at conception and a man becomes a father at birth. And that disconnection really was against God's design, because he connected the motherhood and fatherhood together in the womb, and the child is a living reflection of that. Then when I had the sort of uncertainty about what was going to happen for my wife and I, my wife Yvette and I, in terms of moving forward, the one thing I was certain about was that there was a life growing inside of her, and it wasn't a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for. And that really informs a lot of the work that we do at CareNet, because we actually looked at sort of the story of the birth of Christ, because what you see is that you have the same kind of dynamic. Here's Mary facing an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective, hopes and dreams for her life that don't include a child at this time in this way. And she's encouraged, and what does she do? She chooses life. And essentially the work that we do at pregnancy centers is trying to encourage women to ascribe to themselves the virtue and the character of Mary, to choose life. Despite all the uncertainty of what they don't know, focus on the certainty of what they do know. Now, for a lot of folks who read that story, which is in the first chapter, the first book of the New Testament, they stop there. But you need to keep reading, because what did God do to make sure that Mary's unplanned pregnancy wasn't a crisis pregnancy? Well, he sent an angel to Joseph. And Joseph had a plan. He was going to divorce her quietly. And the angel comes to him and tells him what? Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, not your baby mama, your boo, your shorty, but your wife. And so what you see in that narrative is that you have the sanctity of life, yes, but that's after the sanctity of marriage and family, those two things together. And in God's design, you don't have marriage and family without men. And so when you start thinking about the life issue through that perspective, even though the way that a woman becomes pregnant, like my wife becoming pregnant was obviously very different from Mary's, the practical consequence and the circumstances were very similar because Mary had hopes and dreams. What's Joseph going to say? What's my family going to say? How I'm going to take care of this child? All that uncertainty swirling around. And she chose life. And so the guy was called into that as well. The father was called into that as well. And Joseph was called to do two things, to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her. So when we think about this issue in terms of like a way forward, then we have to be calling men. And I'll just give one other point. We did a national survey with Lifeway, and we asked women who had abortions, who did they talk to about their abortion decision? We gave them a long list, their mother, their best friend, Planned Parenthood, all of that. Number one was the guy who got her pregnant. Then we asked who was the most influential in her decision to abort. Guess who she said? The father of the child. Now, we just finished a similar survey of men. Men who had been participating in abortion, same thing. We asked them the same questions. Who did she talk to more than anyone else? Him. Wasn't even close. And then we asked who was the most influential in her decision to abort. Guess who was? Him. So you can't be thinking about the life issue without having this perspective of engaging men, because the woman who's facing an unplanned pregnancy is being influenced by him. Although it's her body, right, and her choice in a lot of ways in terms of the Roe v. Wade narrative and the messaging that's out there, the reality is that he still has a role in that, and his decision to step into that role to be a husband and a father impacts her choice and her decision. So I learned that early on when I was a 20-year-old, when my wife was sitting there with her hopes and dreams of becoming a doctor or graduating from Princeton, and people telling her that could never happen. The reality was that even though she made that choice, my decision also impacted that choice. And so we need to be calling men in the same way that we're calling women to tap into their inner Mary. We should be calling men to tap into their inner Joseph and try to build strong families. And that's a key part of CareNet's ministry model.
Man, that just seems to be one of the devil's most commonly used tactics, is to try to dismantle the correct narrative and take some issue out of context and just make it about something else. And I love that you are putting the idea of life back into the context of family and motherhood and fatherhood beginning at conception. That's just brilliant, and we need to get back to that narrative. I'm so happy that you're doing that. And there are those who are profiting off of the whole abortion industry. And so it makes sense to them, makes sense to me, that they would want to disconnect the baby and the birth and the mother from the father and from the idea of marriage and family and God's design. And of course, that's exactly what they're doing. Roland, let me ask you, when someone walks into one of the pregnancy care centers as part of CareNet, how is she greeted? How is she met? And what's the kind of counseling that she receives?
The thing that we really try to do on the front end, too, is our brand promise, if you will. I'm a business guy, so I have to use some business terms, is really for her to have compassion, hope, and help, because we model what we do after what Christ did. He offered compassion, that gave people hope, and then he gave them help. And so we do the same thing with someone who's facing a pregnancy decision. We meet them at their point of need, and then we call them into this relationship so that we can start offering them the type of support that they need and try to help them understand their options and understand that this life growing inside of them is not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for. But the other piece clearly, too, is that ideally we want the guy to come as well, because we know that his impact and his support for this life decision impacts her. 86% of the women who've had abortions historically have been unmarried women. And so this whole notion of engaging men is so critically important, both at the point of conception, obviously, but then also as she's making this decision and struggling with the missing support, if you will, that can happen if the guy does not step into that role. And so one of the things that we clearly want to do as we walk her through the different options that she has is we want to try to engage the guy and have a ministry partner with him while we're also talking with her.
You've also talked about the importance of not just being pro-life, but pro-abundant life. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's good that you asked that, because really talking about John 10:10, where Christ said, I came that you might have life and then have that life abundantly. And the insight that we had was that when you really look at that verse and unpack it in the Greek, he's talking about two types of life. He's talking about bios, which is physical life, but he's also talking about Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with Christ. So essentially what he's saying is, I came to link your bios with my Zoe. And when you think about that in the life context, it means that we can't just be focused on saving the baby in physical life, as God honoring as that is. We also want to make sure that that child is a heartbeat that's heaven bound, because that's really what Christ wanted us to be, heartbeats that are heaven bound, to link our bios to his Zoe. And so from a pro-abundant life perspective, you're really thinking about it in that context, because Jesus wasn't pro-life. Jesus was pro-abundant life, and the way that we know that is because he said he was. And so a key part of the pro-abundant life perspective is that first piece that I talked about, which is God's design for family. God's design for family. That's the first pillar that holds up sort of that pro-abundant life roof, and that's the reason why we're focused on not just saving babies as God honors as that is, but also building strong families so we can break that intergenerational abortion cycle that happens too much, and that happens too much in our culture.